to come along this afternoon. It's wonderful to be among friends and to be talking about a man who has influenced all of our lives one way or the other. Please excuse me for wearing my glasses. My eyes are not what they used to be, so I need them if I'm looking at anything that's a little small. I'm talking about the idea of openness. We have heard a great deal in recent years about new forms of openness in scholarly and pedagogical activity. Reference has been made to open education, open learning, open knowledge, open technology, open content, open source, and open courseware. In surveying some of this work, it sometimes appears as if such initiatives have come from nowhere, with a history no older than a decade or two and no discernible epistemological or ethical roots. Openness is often viewed merely as an unfolding reality, an outcome of new social practices and modes of cultural life in the digital age. Attention also needs to be paid, however, to the philosophical heritage of discourses on openness and to some of the conceptual contours of openness as an ideal. This paper considers what it might mean to talk of openness as an educational virtue. Drawing principally on the work of Paulo Freire, but with prior reference to Aristotle and a range of other thinkers, I set out to show that openness has ontological, epistemological, and ethical dimensions. Openness has application in multiple areas of educational life and can serve as a principle for both lifelong learning and social organisation. The optimal pursuit of openness in pedagogical settings, I shall argue, requires the presence of other virtues and can be contrasted with various forms of closure, including dogmatism, excessive certainty, and an unreflective rejection of either the old or the new. Openness, it will be noted, also has its limits, and education has an important role to play in identifying these. In what sense might openness be considered a virtue? To address this question, it's first necessary to ask what we mean by virtue. A concern with virtues and the virtuous person has a lengthy history in Western philosophy. It's often traced back to the ancient Greeks and particularly to Aristotle. For Aristotle, virtues are neither feelings nor faculties, but dispositions. Aristotle defines a virtue as a purposive disposition lying in a mean that is relative to us and determined by rational principle. The doctrine of the mean specifies, in the realm of human virtue, that which is neither excessive nor deficient. Thus, in relation to fear and confidence, we might see rashness as the excessive tendency, cowardice as the deficiency, and courage as the mean. Deficiency and excess, Aristotle notes, are not one and the same for all. Aristotle distinguishes between two types of virtue, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue, he says, owes both its inception and its growth chiefly to instruction, and for this reason needs time and experience. Moral virtues are engendered in us neither by nor contrary to nature. We are constituted by nature to receive them, but their full development in us is due to habit. We acquire virtues by exercising them. We learn, Aristotle maintains, by doing. Aristotle does not identify openness as one of the virtues. He does, however, discuss a number of dispositions that might be said to be compatible with openness, such as truthfulness, resourcefulness, understanding, and patience. While we might, from an Aristotelian viewpoint, regard open-mindedness as a virtue, with, say, closed-mindedness as the deficiency, it is not clear exactly how we should characterise the excess. A term such as intellectual permeability, indicating an indiscriminate openness to everything, could be a candidate, but this has a certain clumsiness to it. There are, moreover, some traditions of thought where this kind of disposition is regarded as desirable. In the Tao Te Ching, for example, Lao Tzu says, "My mind is that of a fool." How blank. Vulgar people are clear. I alone am drowsy. Vulgar people are alert. For a follower of the Tao Te Ching, then, permeability in allowing thoughts to pass freely without a deliberate attempt to order the contents of the intellect or make judgments about quality is a worthwhile state of mind and precisely the kind of openness that should be cultivated. Openness, I want to suggest, is inclusive of, but not limited to, open-mindedness. Openness is or can be not merely an individual disposition, but also a particular orientation to action and relationships, a property of systems, and an organising principle within societies. Openness has not one but several opposites. Most have something to do with closure. Closed-mindedness is one example, but we might also talk about closed systems and closed societies. Indeed, when attention is drawn to the need for openness, it is frequently in response to something less than open in the social world. For example, the censoring of websites or emails, or the withholding of institutional information, or the stifling of open debate. An Aristotelian framework, then, does not take us far enough when analysing openness as a virtue. It is helpful, nonetheless, in prompting deeper investigation of the philosophical underpinnings to any discussion of virtue, and Aristotle's influence on contemporary ethics cannot be underestimated. His more recent interpreters, such as Alistair MacIntyre, have accepted the importance for ethical theory of examining virtues, but have sought to go beyond Aristotle's metaphysical biology. Richard Rorty, too, while respecting Aristotle's attempt to break away from Plato's theory of forms, was critical of the lingering universalism in Aristotelian epistemology. Aristotle, it seems, retained a conception of the intellect as something special, something immaterial and separable from the body. While Rorty did not make openness a key subject of philosophical inquiry, it might be said that he was implicitly committed to it. One example of this is his willingness to consider other forms of writing, particularly literature, in addressing philosophical problems. Others who have done likewise include Stanley Cavell and Martha Nussbaum. Nussbaum is self-consciously Aristotelian in her approach, but Cavell owes more to Wittgenstein, who, along with Nietzsche, paved the way for a subsequent radical reappraisal and purpose of philosophical work. Nietzsche's task, as he saw it, was to provide a revaluation of all values, while Wittgenstein was concerned principally with questions of language and meaning. Both, however, can be regarded as prophetic in foreshadowing a new ethos of openness, not only as a philosophical concept, but as a mode of being and living. The influence of Nietzsche in particular can also be detected in the work of other thinkers whom we might call philosophers of openness, such as Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jean-Francois Lyotard and Gilles Deleuze, to name but a few. These philosophers, however, do not make education their primary concern. In developing a distinctively educational account of openness as a virtue, the work of Paulo Freire is especially helpful. The next section takes up this theme, and in my conclusion, I consider some of the implications of this analysis for the new discourses on open education, open knowledge and open access. Can everyone hear me at the back? Okay?
Yeah, please, thank you.
Okay. The theme of openness provides an arc connecting Freire's earliest books with his last. Openness can be regarded as a pivotal feature of both Freire's educational theory and his pedagogical practice. Openness has a close connection with other epistemological and ethical virtues in Freire's philosophy, but it is not reducible to them. Openness from a Freirean perspective is tied tightly to the very essence of being human, the ontological and historical vocation of humanization. Humanization, as Freire conceives of it, is a process of becoming more fully human through critical dialogical praxis, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it, as we all know from Pedagogy of the Oppressed. As humans, we are unfinished beings. The process of humanization is never complete. As the world and we ourselves are transformed, there will always be a need for further reflection and action. Often we are impeded in this pursuit and thus dehumanized by what happens in oppressive situations with oppressive social structures, practices and attitudes. Addressing oppression in its myriad forms is, from a Freirean perspective, a social process. We never liberate ourselves alone. Knowing, too, from a Freirean viewpoint, is necessarily incomplete. We can never know absolutely. Instead, we can only come closer to knowing the essence that explains an object of study. Freire's account of liberating education grew from his practical experience as a literacy educator working with impoverished adults in both urban settings and rural peasant communities. As such, there's a close link between liberation and the process of struggle against oppression in his work. This does not, however, explain Freire's theory of liberation fully, for there is also a heavy reliance, particularly in his later works, on a virtue-based account of human formation and flourishing. This is significant when considering the concept of openness. In Education, the Practice of Freedom, Freire discusses the concept of openness in relation to the historical development of Brazilian society and as a feature of what he called critical consciousness. Citing Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, among other sources, he charts some of the key features of Brazil's movement from a closed society through a transitional period in the 1950s and early 1960s toward greater openness. In a closed state, Brazil lacked autonomous status, generating cultural alienation and a reliance as a raw materials export-based economy on external markets. In the earlier decades of the 20th century, the country remained fundamentally backward, that's his term, and one that hasn't endeared him to all readers, it must be said, with very high rates of illiteracy and deep social inequalities. Dialogue was discouraged, as changes that had begun with the Industrial Revolution gradually exerted an influence over Brazilian society, the steady state of closure that had been maintained for decades was, to quote from Education, the Practice of Freedom, split apart with the rupture of the forces which had kept it in equilibrium. Yet while urban centres became progressively more open, rural areas remained closed. Landowners maintained tight control over production and profits in peasant communities, with many in the northeast of Brazil in particular suffering horrific rates of disease, malnutrition and infant mortality. As Freire put it, Brazil was a society no longer totally closed, but not yet truly open, a society in the process of opening. With the military coup in 1964, the risk of catastrophic, to use his term, return to even greater closure was heightened. The path to greater openness, Freire argued, was to be found not through the naive consciousness that prevailed in urban areas during the period of transition, but in the development of a more critical consciousness. Among the features of critical consciousness as a concept specifically applicable to the Brazilian context at the time, and not necessarily directly transferable to other contexts, other times, other places, with other purposes and concerns, Freire speaks of, quote, depth in the interpretation of problems, the testing of one's findings and openness to revision, a refusal to transfer responsibility, the practice of dialogue rather than polemics, and receptivity to the new for reasons beyond mere novelty. Critical consciousness, Freire makes clear, demands, quote, the good sense not to reject the old just because it is old. We should, he says, accept what is valid in both the old and the new. Under military rule, Brazil had become authoritarian and rigid, with a culture of silence and inaction. Critical consciousness stands opposed to this, he argued. It is, quote, characteristic of authentically democratic regimes and corresponds to highly permeable, interrogative, restless and dialogical forms of life. These early ideas on openness find further elaboration in multiple books across the rest of Freire's writing career. There isn't space here to comment in detail on all such references, of course, but several key points can be made. As Freire's thought developed, he paid increasing attention to what we might call educational virtues. He had in mind, among other things, dispositions, qualities or characteristics of being human that had particular value in teaching and learning situations. Some of the most commonly mentioned virtues of this kind include humility, the ability to listen, care of and respect for those with whom we work in educational settings. That includes students with whom we work, as well as our colleagues. Tolerance, an inquiring and investigative frame of mind, and a willingness to take risks. This virtues-based approach was consistent with, rather than an alternative to, the persistent Freirean theme of liberation as a process of struggling against oppression. For it is exactly qualities of the kind identified here that must be present if the process of struggle is to be a liberating one from a Freirean perspective. Not all forms of struggle, he demonstrated, are liberating. Educational virtues spring from broader human ideals, the most important of which for Freire is love. Freire had taken heed in his early writings of Che Guevara's portrayal of love as a revolutionary virtue. And in later works, this becomes a dominant theme. Love, for Freire, applies to multiple dimensions of human existence. It is love of the physical environment, the process of study, and our fellow human beings. We are, Freire insisted, beings of communication, and love, exemplified by the respect we show to others, our commitment to them, and our willingness to enter into dialogue with them, is an integral part of bringing this feature of our ontology to life. Educational virtues can be found in individual teachers and students, but they can also be present in groups and evident in systems, structures, policies, and practices. An attitude of openness is a permanent orientation. As unfinished beings, we should, Freire believed, always be open to new ways of understanding the world, new approaches to addressing old problems, new forms of learning, and new modes of communication. Technology should neither be embraced uncritically nor rejected in a reactionary manner. Openness can be contrasted with dogmatism, which Freire spoke against repeatedly and had observed among those on both the political left and the political right. Openness is closely connected with our creativity as human beings, our ability to make history, though not always, as Marx would have reminded us, under circumstances of our own choosing, and to form ourselves also as cultural beings. Openness from a Freirean standpoint also implies other principles of educational importance. To be open in our orientation to education and to human life more generally is to accept that the world, including the inner world of thoughts and feelings, is undergoing constant change. Transformation thus becomes not merely possible, but one of the defining features of our existence. A commitment to openness for Freire also implies a willingness to not only live with, but actively embrace uncertainty. In his later works, he spoke often of the need to become less certain of our certainties. He continued to admit to his own doubts and restlessness as a human being right up to the time of his death. The virtue of openness, as understood from this perspective, can be found in reading, in dialogue, in seeking to know, in our relation to the other, in the way we respond to criticism, and in our attitude to life itself. In reading, we must, Freire insisted, be open to being challenged by the text and to the possibility of challenging it. Dialogue cannot occur without an openness to the process of communication and a trust in the ability of others to engage likewise. Without an openness to the other, we remain locked in a self-centered or ethnocentric world. Openness to constructive criticism allows us to continue growing as learners, teachers, and researchers. What Freire did retain were certain key pedagogical principles throughout his educational career. For example, a commitment to dialogue and to the value of a critical orientation to the world. But he modified, deepened, and extended these ideas and his thinking in many other areas, partly in response to criticism from colleagues and other scholars, including from feminist and postmodern critics. A passage from one of Freire's last books, Pedagogy of Freedom, captures very effectively the position he had reached after a lifetime of reflection, writing, teaching and social action, and is worth quoting in full. In essence, the correct posture of one who does not consider him or herself to be the sole possessor of the truth or the passive object of ideology or gossip is the attitude of permanent openness. Open and being approach, to questioning and being questioned, to agreeing and disagreeing. It is an openness to life itself and to its vicissitudes, an openness to those who call on us and to the many and varied signs that catch our interest, from the song of the bird to the falling rain or the rain that is about to drop from the darkening sky, to the gentle smile of innocence and the sullen face of disapproval, to the arms open to receive and the body stiff with refusal and fear. It is my permanent openness to life that I give myself entirely, it is in my permanent openness to life that I give myself entirely, my critical thought, my feeling, my curiosity, my desire, all that I am. This statement, almost poetic in its lyricism and quite unlike most forms of educational writing, completes the arc that started with education, the practice of freedom. Freire was aware of the importance of openness from his earliest work. From an initial focus on openness as the open society and the open critical mind, Freire broadened the scope of his inquiry to include other dimensions of an open orientation to ourselves, others, and the wider world. When his work is examined holistically, openness can be seen as a mode of educational life incorporating reason, emotion, and willing. It is exemplified by a well-rounded critical consciousness, and it is forged through our actions, our relationships, and our dialogue with other human beings. I'm going to conclude now over the course of 6 or 7 or 8 minutes, and then there should be some time for questions, I hope. While Freire was largely celebratory in his attitude toward openness, this does not mean he was unaware of its limits. Those limits were of more than one kind. He recognised that we are all shaped by social and cultural norms, by the dominant structures and ideas and practices of our time, and that these can limit our ability to identify problems, take a different perspective on complex issues, or conceive of alternatives. He argued, however, that we are conditioned rather than determined by these influences. Education has a key role to play in allowing us to confront our prejudices, encounter others who see the world in a different way, and where appropriate, change our views. Freire also demonstrated that some limits to openness are justified. He made it plain, for example, that he didn't favour an anything goes approach to pedagogy. Teaching and learning should not be so open that discipline and structure disappear altogether. He stressed that educational dialogue, while not closing off opportunities for going down potentially fruitful and unanticipated pathways of inquiry, should also have a strong sense of purpose and rigour, structure and direction. What can we learn from Freire that is worth that is worth knowing and considering current discourses on openness? He was not an Aristotelian scholar in the traditional sense of that term, but he would have accepted much of what Aristotle had to say about the nature of virtue. The spirit of openness toward new ways of theorising, new ways of addressing ontological, ethical and linguistic questions, characteristic of writers such as Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Rorty, Cavell, Derrida and others, was also shared by Freire, even though he differed from these thinkers, as they do from each other, on some important matters of philosophical substance and style. Openness from a Freirean perspective is not merely open-mindedness, though that is no small part of it. Openness for Freire is also within certain limits, always so, some of which need to be challenged, others of which are desirable for educational purposes. From Freire, we can learn that there is no one virtue of openness, but rather many virtues of openness. Or to put this another way, we might say that the virtue of openness can and should be conceived, displayed and experienced in different ways, depending on the context. In the educational realm, some virtues of openness are evident in intellectual or epistemological dispositions. Others are exhibited in our ethical conduct. It is possible, however, to go beyond this and speak of virtues of openness being evident in the way systems operate, institutions are organised, or societies are structured. Finally, these distinctions are worth keeping in mind when contemplating contemporary claims about the need for greater openness in education and scholarship. Those areas like open education, open learning, open access and so on, to which I referred at the very beginning of the talk. It is often implied that openness is a virtue, but the senses in which this might be so are not always considered carefully. From Freire, we can learn the value of unpacking some of the ontological, epistemological, ethical and political assumptions that underpin our thinking about openness. Freire teaches us to be context-specific in the forms of openness we seek to uphold or explain or limit. Within some educational contexts, there may be multiple virtues of openness evident at any given time, and there is merit in analysing these for the respective contributions they make to teaching and learning in those contexts. Freire shows us that openness is not merely a technical matter where changes in procedures alone will suffice, or a set of rules to be followed, or a prescription of dispositions to be developed, or a checklist of methods to be employed by the teacher. Educational openness from a Freirean perspective is an orientation to life itself, to the way we live in the world, individually and collectively, within and outside institutions, in countries with different histories and problems and opportunities. Embracing openness, but not uncritically so, and within limits, is very much a holistic commitment, but one that has arguably never been more needed than at the current time. Thank you.